Well, thanks so much for joining us, both those of you in person and those online. So I've been really excited about this event. This is one in our yet unnumbered series, actually dealing with the so-called birth dearth, or the crisis in total fertility that some countries have started to think about, but not very many voters are thinking about it. If you were to ask the average voter, I think, in the top 30 things that they're concerned about, they probably wouldn't lead with total married fertility, right? That's a kind of very specific thing. But it is probably the crisis that is the most important crisis that no one's thinking about. And in some ways, the crisis in fertility for virtually every developed nation is a kind of condensation or a distillation of other cultural indicators. And so we want to talk a bit about that today. So what is the demographic crisis if you're just new to this? It's basically this. The US, like I said, virtually all developed countries are failing to replace their population. You may have seen last week in 2023, the total fertility rate in the United States dropped to 1.62, which is well below the so-called replacement rate of 2.1. 2.1 is this sort of statistical abstraction. It's the ratio of the number of children born to the number of women of childbearing years, effectively. And so if a country is going to replace itself, an advanced country, you need to have a total fertility of 2.1. If you're below that as a country, that means you're not replacing yourself. And accepting for immigration, your population will go down over time. Now, why is this a threat? Well, it's a threat primarily because it reflects a decline in the stable married families that are the fundamental cell of civilization. That's the emphasis that the Heritage Foundation place on this. We shouldn't think of fertility as a mere abstraction, as if we could solve it, for instance, if we could create, I don't know, I'll introduce a kind of dystopian image, but imagine that we can create artificial wombs in which a child can be fertilized and gestated for all 9 months of development. And it can be run by robots and be entirely automated. So we really lower the opportunity costs and the real costs to producing babies. And we solve the fertility crisis. Now, does anyone think that solves the crisis? No, I mean, intuitively, no, that doesn't quite sound right. We want children born, but we want children born in a particular context. And we know on both philosophical grounds and statistical grounds that children are best raised in the homes of their married mothers and fathers. And so policymakers and policy analysts have just started thinking about this. We spent about, I say, the last 14 months, those of us in domestic policy at the Heritage Foundation, analyzing this. And the first thing you discover, I see a couple of my colleagues that have been crunching the numbers on this, it's a super complicated issue that doesn't reduce to one variable. But something else you discover is that it seems that the main drivers of something like fertility aren't exactly policy. There's something more fundamental, like religious and metaphysical beliefs. And that's what we want to talk about this afternoon. And we're joined, fortunately, by two friends of mine and authors of brand new books, both of which deal with this issue. And I've put them up here. And it's a pure coincidence that the color scheme is the same. It's a pure coincidence that they were actually released on the same day, March 13th of this year. And I knew this. I know Tim and Catherine and thought, oh man, I wonder how that's going to go. So I read them together. And these are amazingly complementary books. Complement with the E. And in other words, they fit nicely together. They're not the same book. They treat the subject in perfectly complementary ways. So it's so great to have both of them here. So let me introduce our panelists, and then we'll get started. Catherine Pacalek is an economist, and she's the associate professor at the Bush School of Business at the Catholic University of America. Her work has been featured in Fox News, The Wall Street Journal, Slate, and more. She holds a doctorate in economics from Harvard University. She's the mother of 8 children, and she and her husband, Michael, split their time between suburban Maryland and New Hampshire's White Mountains. And she's the author, as I mentioned, of the new book, Hannah's Children, The Women Quietly Defying the Birth Dearth. Tim Carney is a father of 6, a columnist for the Washington Examiner, and a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Tim and his wife, Katie, have raised their kids in suburban Maryland and Northern Virginia. He's the author of 4 books, and most recently, the book we'll be discussing today, Family Unfriendly: How Our Culture Makes Raising Children much harder than it needs to be. Please join me in welcoming Catherine Pekalik and Tim Carney to the stage. Good to see you both. It's fun to be able to actually interview friends, close friends. And Tim and I'm going to tell a brief story. Tim and I, we knew of each other and knew each other for years, but not that well. And then we were both speaking, I think it was in 2022 at Acton University, right? And happened to be ending, so we're at this event in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and it ended. And the morning of the ending, I was in a hotel room with my younger daughter who had attended, and woke up early to news that Roe v. Wade had been overturned. And so I'm in a hotel room at 7 a.m. or something. And so I, of course, woke up my daughter to tell her about it. She was thinking she was going to sleep late. And then we all went to the airport and didn't see anyone we knew. And then so my daughter and I sat there for probably there 2 hours in the airport. And I looked down, and Tim was walking down the hall looking around like this. And he looked, he's like, in other words, he saw someone he knew. And he did this. He was looking for somebody to hug because Roe v. Wade had been overturned. I was the guy that got that. I will absolutely never forget it. And so it was delightful to know that you guys were working on this book. I could tell equally embarrassing stories about Catherine, but I won't. They'd be more embarrassing probably. So these are amazing books, but you both zeroed in, I think, on something that we want to talk about. But first, I want to know very specifically why you wrote the books you did. So Catherine, why Henna's Children?
Yeah. So you mentioned that when you look around and you look at the birth dearth problem, you kind of get this sense that policy isn't really the lever. Mm-hmm. And then, you know, the flip side of policy isn't the lever is something like this. Like, birth rates are down everywhere. They're down in countries that redistribute, countries that have a lot of pro-family policy. So, you know, I was thinking, well, you know, there's a lot of people out there who are having kids. We know that they tend to be religious. We know that they tend to be church attending. But when you get that out of your mouth, sort of people think two things. Mm-hmm. They think two things. And I figured both things were wrong, but we didn't have a good way to say why. People think church attending people have a lot of kids because they're sort of, you know, they're old-fashioned and they don't believe in birth control. Mm-hmm. All right. I mean, I heard this yesterday from somebody. Doesn't that just explain it? Is there anything else to explain? These are all people not using birth control. They don't plan. Okay. The other thing that you hear is people who are church attending have a lot of kids because some charismatic pastor or the Pope or rabbi says, you know, you're a better person mm-hmm. if you have all these kids. And so both of those seem to me wrong based on my personal experience. And I thought, this is actually widely unknown. Mm. It's widely unknown that there are people choosing to do this for reasons that are probably articulatable, mm-hmm. and they haven't been articulated. And so I thought, well, that's the job. Go out and sort of figure out, like, you know, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'll find out they're all doing it because they're brainwashed. And right. I didn't think so. But, you know, that's the story. So go out. And so I thought there was a story to tell. And then I hoped that what I would learn would be the type of things that we could then apply and derive, I think, sensible policy lessons from. So,
Tim, so yours is really family unfriendly. It's about the way in which our culture makes actually having a large family difficult. What got you on this beat?
Yeah, so during the pandemic, I was talking to the editor who had edited my previous book, and I said, well, I think the biggest story of the last 60 years was the collapse of civil society, and the biggest story going forward is the disappearance of families, the collapse in the birth rate. And he said, is this going to be a book where you're just wagging your finger at people who don't have kids or don't have as many kids as you? And I was saying, well, maybe that's what I was thinking of writing, but you're implying that that's a bad idea. Yeah. So what about, you know, what are the forces in our society that are discouraging people from getting married, from having kids, from having another kid? And then as I started to think about that, I had a friend, you probably know him, Matt Meehan, who said, you should read Shakespeare's sonnets. And I said, why? He said, well, because it's really just, you know, trying to convince people to have babies, but it starts with like the very day-to-day quotidian. It's like, you're so beautiful, there should be more people like you. And then it builds up till the harder. And so I thought I'll start with travel sports taking up all your time and money and build up towards like the anthropology and the view of the human. So that's, yeah.
Okay, I want to come back to the travel team trap. But so, Catherine, describe a bit, because it's an unusual book. It's structured, and I'll just speak as a reader. It's based upon these detailed interviews you did with 55 mothers of 5 or more kids, which you had a very particular way of selecting. But it's also written by a very serious and thoughtful economist, and so which that insight manages to be embedded throughout, but it still just feels sort of like a narrative treatment. So why that approach?
I just like to do hard things, so I thought, no, like, can you make social science readable? I mean, like, right? That's part of it. But why that approach? I mean, I'll so 2 things. One is because if you're working with qualitative data, and I'll maybe say next why I chose the qualitative approach, but you're working with qualitative data, your data is the narrative. Your data is the story. That's the data. I've had some people say, oh, well, how come you chose not to do a data-driven story? And I'm like, no. This is actually it shows you how wrong we are when we think about statistical averages. Yeah. They're data, but they're data that's derived from people. So we've already abstracted too much. But if your data is the narrative, then what you really want to try to do is let your narrative shine, because what the value added here isn't my commentary. What's valuable is you don't have to travel around the country and interview all these people. Hopefully you could just sit there and read it like should be. So that was the goal, was to make that shine. And then maybe the second piece is kind of why that, and why not something more data-driven, something more quantitative. And that really has to do with this kind of the vantage point I'm sitting and looking at. I mean, of course, my training in economics was more quantitative. Economists stopped interviewing people a long time ago. But why sort of at this moment? Well, and that gets us back to the puzzle that you raised at the beginning. I mean, what's our moment from the perspective of the academy, the scholarship? I didn't write this merely for the public. I did intend to make a contribution to the scholarship. The moment we're in the scholarship is we all know what the statistics say. We know where the averages are going. What we are lacking is a refinement of our theory about what it is that's happening with birth rates. And we think about kind of like, if you will, you'll forgive me, like the economist question, the supply question, the demand question. Children are really, really interesting good, because the same people who might demand them, might want to have them, also have to produce them. To your point about the surrogate wombs, right?
There's an argument to be made there.
Yeah. So when you look at the thing and you go, well, if people aren't choosing this, is it because they don't want babies as much as they used to? Is there a demand problem? Or is there some kind of obstacle to supply? And so untangling that, you need to do some theory, right? And so how do you get theory in the social science? That's where you interview people. That's where you do the narrative thing. So those are the pieces.
So Tim, your book is very much, it's sort of drawn from your own experience as a professional dad in the Washington, D.C. area with a lot of kids. And so you became acutely aware of how unfriendly the sort of structure of the streets and the sidewalks and all these things around us are. And you talk about this travel team trap. What is that exactly?
So, I mean, I became acutely aware of the difficulties, but also I was blessed with sort of living in subcultures that were extraordinary. And so the first word of the preface and the first word of chapter 1, both of them begin with the word baseball. One of them is a T-ball program at a neighboring parish, which we then imitated, where the T-ball was an excuse for a barbecue, a cookout every Friday, or ordering pizza during Lent and then grilling burgers afterwards, and just to give parents a place to bring their children and ignore them while we hung out with other adults. But then the contrast to that was when we accidentally put my oldest boy in travel baseball. I let him try out for this travel team because I thought he would get cut. Then he ended up making it. And the first day was an indoor. I know this airs. I think I've said that to him before, but if I haven't, sorry, Charlie. The first day was an indoor winter practice, like winter workout for 12-year-olds. And the first thing the coach says, Charlie comes back and reports to me, says, first thing coach said was, baseball isn't fun. Winning baseball is fun. And then ours wasn't even that bad travel. I think Frederick, Maryland was the farthest we had to go. But it was, multiple practices a week. We can call practice, 8 hours before. We might tell you at bedtime that you guys had practice the next day. The coaches were super intense. And all they couldn't understand that the sport wasn't just about sort of winning and developing pro baseball players. The idea of fun, the idea of developing virtues, all of those things were totally lost. And then I realized how many other people, I'd actually started to realize this from when I played baseball in my 20s, and we'd run into these travel programs, and 14-year-olds told they had to quit playing their second sport and just do one sport year-round. They had to specialize in middle school. And then I realized how corrosive it could be to family culture. And if you have kids who play hockey or swimming, you almost don't have a choice. It takes up your calendar, then gets set by these coaches. So it's disruptive to family life, but it's also, again, reflective of sort of a bad anthropology, a bad understanding of what youth sports are for, and a bad understanding of what kids are for.
Yeah. Well, and that, and of course, the travel team trap is a sort of, it's a metaphor for all these kinds of things that we found ourselves in.
Irish dancing.
Yeah,
yes.
all this stuff. And so I guess I wonder, did starting those things make it more difficult to have kids, or did people having fewer kids lead us to do these kinds of things?
I always say the causality goes in both directions. But so one of the great terms, horrible terms I learned from economists was, well, in wealthy societies where people have control over their fertility, people are choosing quality over quantity. The implication is that we all chose quantity and throw but what they call high quality parenting is in fact bad. Yeah. We just had the Journal of Pediatrics come out and say the crisis of anxiety among young people is because of a lack of unsupervised play. Yeah. It's because quality helicoptering, over-ambitious and over-intensive parenting. Those things are not just stressful and exhausting for the parents, they're bad for kids. They're bad for communities. Yep. They're bad for all sorts of things. So when people have fewer kids, they become more intensive, and when the norms are more intensive, people have fewer kids.
Wow. A vicious cycle, feedback in both ways. So let's turn to the topic of this panel, religion. So Catherine, how did you, it won't surprise anyone that these 55 mothers, it wasn't a bunch of village atheists that you found, but you also didn't go out looking for religious mothers, right? What was the selection process?
Yeah, no, I mean, well, when you interview 55 people, you're not getting what we would call a statistically representative sample. That didn't bother me that much because the goal of this kind of qualitative interviewing is not to describe a population. We already know they're more religious. So my job was to go out and find some of them. So we picked geographical diversity. We knew we wanted to go all over the country. We knew we wanted to, hit some big states. And so each place that we selected, we looked for places where there's families with kids, big, like mega churches, homeschooling networks of lots of folks. And so we kind of did a word of mouth thing, which is, the normal best practice for this kind of thing. Invited people to apply, but among those people, everybody we selected at the end of the day identified as being a religious adherent of some kind or another. They varied dramatically in how intensely they practiced or what kinds of religious beliefs they did. But the least religious person in my sample. I say least religious. She said, well, the children is not part of the Jewish part. So she's, not quite Reform Jewish, but not as super Jewish as some of the other people I interviewed. So yeah, they were mostly religious.
Yeah. So Tim, how would you say religion figures in this? It's of course it's a prominent topic of your book, and I'm going to come back to Israel, but first, sort of in your own situation.
Yeah. So. It's hard. I'm going to try to not start with Israel. I tried to make Israel the middle chapter in my book, but then I accidentally ended up with an even number of chapters. So I was a very bad Straussian in that regard. There is no one middle chapter. So the first question is, and this goes back to my previous book, Alienated America, where I said, and it was to a group of pastors I first said it, and I had to apologize. I said, in religious communities, the homilies matter less than the ministries. And of course, one of the jokes about churches in America today is that there's a ministry for there's like an ultimate Frisbee ministry. But all that stuff really matters in supporting families, in supporting individuals. How much is there a sense of community? So for us, when we got married and embedded in a parish or three in Silver Spring, Maryland, just seeing the slightly older families, some of whom are here today, gave us not only babysitters, but also like okay, like you can do this.
Yeah.
And then to see the people who we thought of as like they're really good parents and like, wait, they don't bring their 18-month-old to mass. We can skip a few months and then try to hope they behave later. So you got babysitters, you got modeling, you have meeting grounds to meet your future spouse, the more embedded you are in a community. And for most of American history, the religious congregation was the central organ of community. So that's the most sort of utilitarian role of religion in being pro-family and promoting it. I also just think civil society broadly, its benefits happen when people are joined together in pursuit of a higher good that's outside of themselves. And religion absolutely casts that. And to quickly touch on Judaism in Israel, the idea of an inheritance being something that's both a blessing and a duty, like that's kind of absent in a lot of individualistic current America. If you have something either that was handed down to you, that you didn't choose, either it's an unearned good and you should feel guilty, or it's an unwanted obligation and you should shuffle it off. Religion, not just Judaism, but religion gives you that idea like, okay, no, an inheritance is something to take care of and to take seriously.
So let's say a little more about Israel. I don't think we've mentioned. So Israel is the massive outlier among in the developed world of a total fertility. It's about 3.0, so well above replacement. People that have not been to Israel might think all Israelis are very religious. They're not. There's a huge sort of spectrum. But you talk a bit about that in the book. Even the secular Israeli.
So and I was really pleasantly surprised that Israel's government broke it down, and they have a category for secular Jews. So they've got religious Jews of like highly, moderately, low, and then secular. And they've got atheists as a separate category, as well as Muslims, etc. Secular Jews had a birth rate of 2.0. So that's higher than any country in Europe. That's it's closer to like church-attending Catholics in the U.S. than it is to the average American, or it's about halfway in between. And so then what I did is I traveled there to Israel, and I only had sort of 2 extra days after this religious pilgrimage to interview people, and I was, again, pleasantly surprised that basically, if you ask an Israeli their opinion, they give it to you very long and on the record. And and I deliberately went to Tel Aviv, and the first guy there I met, I said, I'm writing about your, the high birth rate here. He goes, oh, no, yeah, it's horrible. We have way too many babies. And he points at Jerusalem. The religious people there, he's giving me this spiel while kicking a soccer ball back and forth with his 4-year-old. And at one point, his 2-year-old runs up and he picks him up. And his wife is there with them. I'm thinking, what a country. The anti-kid people have 2 kids under the age of 5. And another guy said, God has no role in our family planning. And he had 3 children. And so it was really interesting to me because a religious man I'd met in Jerusalem said, no, it's just a religion. Another guy said it's the mitzvah, the first commandment, be fruitful and multiply. And so there's these definite disagreements. And the image I came up with was a garden where the central tree is religion. Lots of people eat from that tree. Then there's the tribe, the whole history of the multiple efforts to extinguish Jews from the earth. Then there's the current geopolitical situation. Even if you don't care about any of those 3, you're all of a sudden living in an ecosystem that is created to support people having kids. So I think if you conducted an experiment where you took a random American and you plopped them down, a random married couple, and plopped them down in Israel, I think they would have more kids than they otherwise would. Just little things like how the neighborhoods are built around playgrounds, how one guy in Kent Mill, Maryland said, the bus drivers in Israel have a real affection for the kids. There's a million things from the most quotidian up to a broader idea of purpose and hope for the future that are caused by religion, the tribe, the geopolitical situation, but they affect the whole culture and make the whole culture more family-friendly.
Catherine, you have a very interesting analysis of the way religion does and doesn't sort of dictate these things.
Yeah. Well, I really like the tree analogy. It's a great one. And one of the reasons that's a really interesting finding, right, is that then what you want to say to countries that are thinking about this is like, protect the tree. Right? Like, at all costs, protect the tree. Everybody doesn't have to be, at the root of the tree necessarily. But the tree is going to in ways that are, in a sense, unintended. The tree is going to provide shade, and it's going to provide helpfulness, and it's going to have there's going to be a better soil. So so that interaction. I mean, I think the other way, the other way that I like to think about the role of religious faith, it's not that costs don't matter. It's not that norms don't matter. These other types of things. But you think about it. I like to think about it as like running a marathon. It's, having kids it's like a lifetime thing. I mean, this is probably the best answer to why the surrogate AI wombs or whatever these are. I forgot what they're supposed to be called. Like whatever that. It's just a terrible dystopian image. It's like the best reason why that doesn't solve the problem is that once the children come out of these little hatcheries, they still need to be raised. So the point is the opportunity cost is always there. I mean, the general sense that like it's a pretty hard thing to commit yourself to somebody forever, and like try to work it out and like not be angry with the partner that you created this child with, and try to do that for 20 years or 30 or 40. So what gives people the energy to do that? Kind of like it's like where does the root of the tree come from? Where does the energy for that come from? And just want to distinguish between the two parts, right? Like you can have a really healthy seed and a healthy tree, and then you could sort of deprive it of shade, or you could do other things to block its organic growth, right? That would be sort of like things that the culture or things that maybe misguided governments do. And maybe we could talk about some of those examples. You could do those things, but then you wouldn't want to fail to investigate, well, where does the healthful tree come from? So I like to say, look, the healthful tree is the sort of the equivalent of like people who, and it doesn't have to be everybody, but people who kind of wake up in the morning and you go, actually, I think I'd like to prepare to run a marathon. And you're like, that's amazing, because I would never want to run a marathon. Like, you'll never catch me running a marathon. I've never wanted to. But every now and then you see these like fitness people, and they're on YouTube, and they're like, and you could almost get there. You're like, he's kind of describing. I mean, it's like these cold water bath people. Yeah. Like, do you do this? I don't. Of course you do.
We will talk about it later.
But I mean, it's just like you couldn't pay me enough to jump in a bucket of ice. But you go like, where does that come from? And of course, where it comes from, I mean, somebody might like give you a list of all these, but at the end, like there's some fundamental inspiration that's really deep, and it's really important. And it's not just a 5-minute water bath. It's gonna be like the next 50 years. So where does that come from? And I think that by and large, that's what religion does for us. It's grace. It's conviction. So we can't just get people to want to do those things by just making the cost lower.
Yeah. And you mentioned, and so I want to make it explicit, opportunity cost, because I think this is the thing that people looking at this from the outside don't get initially. They say, well, look, we are much richer now than Americans were 100 or 200 years ago. How is it that we have fewer and fewer kids? It's a sort of artificial analysis of the cost, because you have an increase in opportunity costs, especially for women. This completely different scenario. So there's actually more to give up. Talk a bit about that.
Totally. That's right. Well, we could talk about the origin. I mean, the big shift of mothers into the workforce takes place in roughly 1960. At least that's when the shift takes place. And why does it take place then? It takes place then because this is the moment which scholars will call the contraceptive revolution. Now you have kind of like easy, effective, reversible birth control. I mentioned reversible, right? You don't have to be sterilized. This is something you can turn it on and you can turn it off. And what that means is a lot of people would like to kind of mix it up. They think, well, if I want to couple up when I'm 19 or 20, which by the way is pretty much the universal time to couple up. It's a good and human thing to do. Well, now I don't have to couple up and skip more school or skip something else that seems cool, because I can turn this thing off and then I can turn it back on again. This is a huge change because it changes the choice set. It changes the choice set. So the opportunity cost comes around, and we know this from a lot of studies. It comes around from basically once you increase educational opportunities, people are now comparing, well, I could have another kid, or I could finish this degree, I could get this thing done. And basically, people would like to do a little bit of both, and that's great. So the opportunity cost thing, I mean, putting it back into the marathon analogy, if you said to me like, hey, like I'm gonna give you a free ticket to the Boston Marathon, I understand it's not easy to get a ticket to run the Boston Marathon if you're one of these people. You made the ticket free, you gave me new sneakers. Would that make it more likely that I would do it? And I would think like, well, no, because for me, like think about how many hours you got to spend out there on the pavement. That's the opportunity cost. It's not just the outlay of the cash. It's all that time. And then maybe the personal suffering. Like my body's going to change. I'm going to be sore every day. Like I don't like any of that. Right? So that's the opportunity cost.
Well, so let's pivot from this to the question, of course, that we have to ask at some point here. We're the Heritage Foundation, right? We do public policy. So the role of public policy for good, ill, or for nothing. And so, Tim, I was going back through your book and noticed how many things you talked about are sort of local or municipal rather than sort of federal. But I mean, first of all, what's your sense about the role of public policy in playing in the reduction of the birth rate and also its potential reversal?
So in general, I think if I got one policy lever to pull that would make a difference, and it wouldn't make a huge difference, but it would relatively to other policy rules changes make a difference, it would be local housing and walkability and bikeability, like sidewalks. In both Montgomery County and Fairfax County, there's so many areas where there's no sidewalks. So parents have to drive kids everywhere. I think that's a huge burden on parents. There's actually evidence that people limiting their cars to two people because of two kids because of car seats has car seat mandates have been a contraceptive effect. But so I would just say help people not need cars would be one of the things I would do. This involves housing, crosswalks, playgrounds, et cetera. I think that there are lots of things that in our policy that do deter, that are done for the sake of the economy or whatever, that do deter family formation. I mean, just the existence of Social Security. One study I read, it was only one study, but it said countries that increase their Social Security benefits and taxes have fewer kids. They're shifting wealth from the family formation period when you're working to later in life, and obviously taking away sort of the old-fashioned idea of your kids are going to help you. But anything that shifts wealth from your 20s and your early 30s to later in life, which the market does that a bit, but any policies that do that, those should be reformed and partly uprooted. So the home mortgage deduction, I think, does that. It drives up the purchase price, but then it pays you back over time. We need the opposite. We need to be making it easier so that a 20-something has more money. Montgomery County just raised its transfer tax. It's just basically the government comes in and steals money when you buy a house. And that's also shifting wealth to later in life, or taking it away from them. So that would be the policy question I would ask, would be how are we making it harder to be a 20-something or a 30-something? Let's stop doing that. But you're right that a lot of it is just going to have to be on the local and state level too.
And a lot of that is sort of get government stop doing stupid stuff that makes this worse. And that's sort of a way to think about this. We don't want government to do anything to make it worse, or ideally neutral. We'd like something in which the benefits exceed the costs, and that's the sort of tough question.
And just to be very quick, and Catherine probably has more to say on this, but as far as international comparison, my very brief summary of it is this: most pro-natal policies don't work except for simply giving large checks to parents for being parents. And that's super expensive. It only works a little bit, and it has lots of risks, such as discouraging marriage.
So, Catherine, I don't want to say you're a skeptic of any kind of policy solutions, but you seem fairly skeptical.
The quick way to put it is I'm skeptical of direct incentives to have children. So, the kind of thing that Tim just described. Again, it's not that there's anything morally wrong about that, sending checks to parents, honoring people's commitments. I mean, I certainly think that the child tax credit, Tim's made a great case for this repeatedly, and I think that I can endorse everything he said about that. There's nothing wrong with these types of things. But one way to think about it is kind of making it easier for people to run that race. That's what the child tax credit does. That's what these things do. But these direct incentive type programs, they don't make more people want to run the race. They can't do that. So I don't mean to say that policy has nothing, but there's a tremendous, policy can have a tremendous effect in protecting the tree, right? Protecting like the tree of life, right? I mean, so recently I've been pointing out to people, now that enough time has passed and like people aren't triggered by this example anymore, but I've been saying like, look, what did we do? Like the minute COVID hit, what did we do? We behaved as if churches didn't matter to anybody. That churches weren't the greatest source of meaning in people's lives, that they didn't need their churches, right? You needed to go to the grocery store. Okay, that was open. You didn't need to go to church. It turns out, I think, countries really need churches to be open. They really need churches vastly more than they need, like all the agencies in DC to continue operating, right? But so there's a lot that I think countries can do, but I think we need to think about not using, like, it's idiotic actually to think that what you're going to do from Washington, D.C. is kind of put little carrots on all the things that you think are the good behaviors. We have to think much more correctly, much more accurately about how people work. They don't do things because of little, nudges of carrots and stuff. I mean, maybe you can get people to not buy big gulps or something like that, or buy less cigarettes that way. But what the government needs people to do is to need their churches. Is when they need their churches, and this is Tim's point, the ministries matter more. They're not going because of the great preaching. I mean, let's just be clear. It's hard to find great preaching. You're going there because you need these people.
Yeah.
And so what governments can do is think, actually, how we cultivate the tree is a huge part, maybe the biggest part of our family policy.
Religious liberty itself.
Right,
yeah, allowing civil society to flourish rather than dwindle. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I'm going to stop there and turn it over to the audience. I think we have a way for people online to give us questions, but we'll certainly take questions here. So, Mary, you can start back here with Roger.
I don't usually quote Stalin.
But when I do.
In favor of pro-family policies. He said that quantity has a quality all its own. And you spoke a bit about the quantity-quality distinction, which makes it sound like it's zero-sum. I agree with you, Tim, that is not the right framework to look at it. I have 6 kids, and I realize that they play with each other and form their own little community, and I could just be an observer and enjoy that little world form and guide it where I need to. So if you could speak a bit about the benefits that come from quantity. It's not just a parent-centric, I'm investing, but that natural community that forms.
Economies of scale. I wrote a piece about this in the Washington Post, actually. There's 7,000 comments on it. And I'm sure they're all positive. Because they gave the headline, the ideal number of children to have, 4 at a minimum, which I'm sure goes over very well with the Washington Post readership. But I'll mostly leave it up to Catherine. But my main answer is just that it's analogous to the approach to sort of government and direct policy. Fostering a culture is going to bring about the goods you want more than direct interventions are. And when you have a bunch of people just in your house, then you're more likely to have that culture.
Yeah, I think, well, to reference something you said earlier, right? What children need is unsupervised play. If only there were some way to get children more unsupervised play without, kind of my kids are just completely unsupervised most of the time. In fact, the more I've traveled,
what's happening now?
I think Abigail Schreier would be delighted because, right. But this is a point people never think about, right? Is you do need to kind of hit a certain number where you're kind of maxed out. You go, well, actually, I'm just focusing on feeding this one human being, the littlest one. The rest of them, I don't know where they are, but they're probably off playing someplace unsupervised, right? It's such a simple and interesting point. And the more I've traveled to talk about this, the more I see that people haven't experienced that. Just last week, I was out with some colleagues at George Mason University, and this was like a revelation to them. And I think it's just ignorance. People haven't seen it. They don't know it can work. And it's remarkable. It's like a whole society of the children and a society of the parents.
And if 90% of, I don't know the number, how many people are from have one sibling at the most? This was a point Catherine's made before. Yeah. If that one sibling is a year and a half younger than you or older than you, then you have no experience caring for a kid. And that feeds to the and it just deprives you of something. And then being a youngest sibling is the best because you learn from your older siblings' mistakes, and it's such a blessing. Yeah.
Actual experiences that you simply can't have if you don't have siblings. Yeah. Absolutely crucial. Thanks, Roger. Yes, right here.
Just have a question about your knowledge of this sort of data and how it's changed over the years. Is there a point at which the number of children seems unique? So is it that people are having a hard time going from 0 to 1, from 3 to 4? Is there something that stands out? Is there a policy solution that might make a difference at any one of those numbers? Where's the biggest change?
About half of it that half of the U.S. demographic decline, at least over the last 15 years, and I think probably over longer, is people not having any kids, is childlessness. And about half of it, I think, is shrinking families. Now, some people say it's actually almost all more childlessness, more people going to zero, but it's certainly at least some shrinking families. I said car seats deterred people from going from 2 to 3, but I think it's across the board smaller. So one question, though, that policymakers, and in Hungary this is one of the things they talk about, is, well, maybe just a number of people are going to be childless. And so what we got to do is help the people who have 2 have 3, and help the people who have 3 have 4. One of the reasons to think about policy that way is you're probably already talking about married couples. And as I said, one of the disadvantages of just giving people money is it will encourage more out-of-wedlock birth, which is not pro-family. And so if there were policy levers that would work, I would say, who's a married couple who has at least 1 kid, how can we help them have another? That might be an easier way to bring about good than try to convince the childless to get married and have kids.
Yeah, I would like to agree with that generally. I would nuance it a little bit. I think the point there is that once you've had 2 or 3 or even 1, the biggest part of the opportunity cost shift has already been born, right? So the lifestyle change. So qualitatively in my interviews, it really came out. I mean, all the women who are up there, you know, like 5 kids, 6 kids, 7, they're like 1 was the hardest number. 1 was the hardest number. So that seems kind of weird, but that's because this is like a really nice intuition about what's the big change. The big change is going from taking care of yourself all day to having to spend your whole day worried about somebody else. And when you first do that, you think this is impossible. I can't keep doing this. And then you learn, like, oh, actually, like it becomes easier. And really, the second kid is not as hard as the first kid in a sense. There's like a kind of possibility of like being overwhelmed. People talk about man-to-man defense and then moving to 3 to like zone defense. And but generally what we've found, qualitatively is that in terms of the lifestyle pieces, the more kids you have, the marginal cost of the next child goes down. And that's the explanation for what Tim's saying. Like, if you're going to do a direct incentive, if you're going to do a policy nudge, who's going to be the easiest to nudge? It's going to be the people who have 3 kids, and you're just nudging. I mean, they already have a bad car. They already have given up. Like, they've already restructured. So you're just kind of like, maybe they're already oriented to that. So that the policy cost of the direct incentive is going to be a lot lower in those later years. We don't know of a policy nudge that can get people over that. Now you're talking about how do you get people transitioning to marriage? How do you get people over that 0 to 1? That's way more challenging, and I think that's where we have to talk more about religion.
Well, and marriage, I mean, I don't know how to put this in an unawkward way, so I'll just put it in the awkward way, but I mean, abstractly, we wouldn't want to increase total fertility among unwed people, right, single mothers. And in fact, our colleague Robert Rector noted internally that some of the decline in total fertility since 1996 is a positive thing. It's because welfare reform seemed to lead to a reduction in unwed childbirth. And so, in a sense, ideally, we'd like that to be 0, and we'd like the people that are married and able to have kids to have.
So let me almost argue with that last point you said about the ideal. You could say ideally we would have traffic fatalities and terrorism attacks be 0.
Right.
But the regime it would take to bring that about would be horrible. And I think that that driving down teenage pregnancies, some of the forces that did that also drove down adult married pregnancies. That the people at MTV took credit for a decline in teenage pregnancies with their TV shows was 16 and Pregnant. The markets where that appeared apparently had a greater decline of in teenage pregnancies and teenage births because they said, well, look, a child is gonna like upend and ruin your life. And I think now those same people are now 33, and they're saying a child is going to upend and ruin my life. So so that's just my slight pushback on that. The forces it takes to drive these unwed pregnancies, especially among younger people, down to 0, are also driving family smaller.
I mean, let's just make it really plain. Like, get it out. Like, if we're going to get the awkward stuff out, look, in this city, in this building, for 35 years, people have been collecting really compelling evidence that the correlations they all say, look, whatever positive thing you want to look at, is it marriages? Is it having babies? Is it volunteering? Is it being a good citizen? I mean, like, is it good educational outcomes? Religion is really highly correlated with all of those good things. And then we go out and we go, how can we like propose like some plan where people will get more married? And you're kind of like, why isn't religion like the first thing on the table?
Well, because we don't want the government pulling the lever to make us more religious.
Right.
Prodding us to become more religious. It feels like that would backfire.
And that's because the government seems to have one idea, which is that if you want more of something, you have to directly incentivize it. Sure, I don't want the government to, but what it needs to think about is like, how can we create a culture in which, you know, the churches are doing more things, so people need their churches more. When they need their churches more, they become more religious, turns out, right? Because we're actually super simple. We're not like, oh, you know, I have these lofty ideas about God. You're like, well, you know, where can I get my employment check? At the moment, it's not at church.
Absolutely. All right, one more. Have I picked all men, though? This is not inequitable. I'm sorry. I just saw his hand first.
My name is Cammy Butt, and my question is about Utah. You know, normally people have bigger family because of their religious value. Have you made any study contrast to the secular people, you know, like myself, who don't believe in any religion and might think that more baby I have, more check I would get from Uncle Sam or from local government. So is there any, you know, religion and mindset that play as a factor to have bigger family or smaller family? And related to that, does Utah has any GDP per capita higher than the states where you have most people depend on social welfare and they have a lot of babies and really don't have any much planning about life? Thanks.
I go to Utah a lot. And so first of all, one of the things that was told me by a demographer out there, Natalie Gotchnauer, was she said, the Catholics in America who have the most babies are the Catholics who live in Utah. And that was before I came up with the tree analogy. She said, it's in the air. And this was right before COVID. And so I started to think, like, if people wear masks, do they not get pregnant? No. And so then, I mean, the interactions here are really, really robust, and the causality always goes both ways. Stronger civil society. No state has stronger sort of institutions of civil society where people belong to things more. Bowling alone is least true in Utah. That leads to more families. That also leads to more sort of economic having it togetherness. There's a local human level, community level welfare system run by the church, but then for even people outside of the church, there's just more, you know, neighborliness. Hey, you need a job? Okay. And people help you with that. And then that drives up the birth rate. And having more kids and more families reinforces the communities. And that addresses a lot of the, so you have a welfare state that doesn't have as many of the moral hazards and unintended consequences as you have otherwise because you have civil society there. And so much of the modern project in this town is to take civil society's decay as a given and say, how can we replace it with a state? And that will always fail because part of it is it will crowd out the church. It will crowd out civil society.
Yeah. A little bit of the bad news about Utah is that they've experienced the quickest collapse in birth rates because their birth rates were, you know, still for a long, long time so high above. In part because of its economic success, all of these things that made it great to live there, it's been a magnet for people who want to live a great outdoor, healthy lifestyle. It's like good weather and good mountains and stuff. People moving in, and then of course COVID accelerated that. So they've had a lot of influx of more secular people. So maybe to some extent Utah is our Israel, but
there's secular snowboarders in Utah that aren't in Israel. Or?
Yeah, exactly. So so the danger is there. I mean, the point is you can lose this. You can lose this, and I think that's a really deep and old and ancient human thing to do, which is like things are going well, and you figure it's you. Like, well, it's because we are so good, and Utah, we've got this social capital thing figured out. You're like, oh, actually, it was God. I mean, it was our orientation around God, right? This isn't a new thing, right? We always do this, and so I think that's something to keep in mind, right? We can lose that.
And I always got that question on Alienate America, and this is somebody says, I'm convinced about what you say. So now what can we do that's like religion but not religion?
Not religion, yeah.
And I always start to give them the answer, and then I like my conscience nags at me. I'm like, you can't.
So I want to end with a question that I often get, and it's from young people. It's from our 20-somethings, that constantly encountering, because there's a sense that it's harder than ever to find a mate. And this whole conversation can almost feel like, married people with kids are telling single people that like to get married and have kids, work harder or something. And obviously that's not what we're saying. But I mean, what would be your piece of advice to someone in that station in life?
Well, first of all, I am going to say, yes, it is. I think it is harder. I think the smartphones and all of that stuff has made it harder. I think our cultural values, particularly among liberal Americans, is anti-relationship because it's so vested in individual autonomy. I think the dating apps have broken people's brains. I think the ubiquitous accessibility of pornography has harmed men. I think the decline in conservative norms about postponing sex have also made it so that people, I write in my book about how a sex recession happened in part because saying yes to a date, this is channeled from Christine Emba at The Atlantic, saying yes to a date, you don't know if that's saying yes to sex. All of those norms. So yes, it is actually harder. I don't blame anybody who's finding it much harder to get married than it was 20 years ago. And my only advice would be to immerse yourself in a community where a lot of those forces are less powerful, which is a religious community, and that's where you're gonna. I mean, not that porn hasn't infiltrated there or anything, but that is going to be the thing. Find yourself a circle of people who at least know that these forces are harmful.
Yeah, if you were to look around and say who's beating the odds, who's getting married in spite of this, you find people who go to religious colleges, people who go to state schools with big religious communities, out-state schools. We live next to one, and it's it's really successful. So I mean, you just have to be intentional about it. You again, not that it isn't harder. I've got siblings who found it was harder, but again, like to look around and say who's beating the odds. A lot of people are beating the odds. Yeah.
Please join me in thanking Catherine.
Yeah.
Thank you both. Don't go away. So before we conclude, today's event was actually co-sponsored by the new Master of Public Policy at the Catholic University of America. Catherine and I were actually colleagues at CUA for many years. And another colleague, Tony Gallenstein, is here to tell us a little bit about this program. And what's, I think, really important about this program, first of all, is it takes the Catholic intellectual tradition seriously. So it's not going to just be a kind of vaguely Catholic education, but it also is going to have an emphasis on family life and family policy. So briefly, I want to introduce Tony Gallenstein. It's Dr. Richard Anthony Gallenstein. He's an associate professor of economics and the director of the Masters of Public Policy program at the Catholic University of America. As the director of this program, Tony is passionate about developing innovative approaches to public policy that are rooted in the Catholic intellectual tradition. Please join me in welcoming Tony to the stage.
Hi, everybody. I have to say I'm incredibly honored to be here and to share the stage with such incredible scholars and people whose work I really admire. So at Catholic University of America, we are launching a new Masters of Public Policy program. In fact, this fall will be the first incoming class, the first incoming cohort to our program. And we're really excited to launch this program this year. We think this is a really poignant and important moment to launch this program. In the United States, we are crippled with political division. For the past, 100 years, the perspective towards public policy has been kind of this approach that sees the human person as a fundamentally self-interested and isolated and atomized individual who just interacts with the state. And that has been kind of this dominant paradigm to public policy. And we want to change that. Our program at CUA is a mission program. It's a program that's a part of the mission of the university to train servant leaders to be public policy leaders, to serve the common good, to serve the nation, the church, and the world. As we take an innovative approach to public policy, we're building an innovative approach to public policy that begins with understanding who is the human person and what is the common good. What is this public policy oriented towards? And to train our students not only in the technical skills like data analytics and how to navigate the policy process, but also to train our students in virtue. How can we have the wisdom to discern what is a good policy? What is a good policy once we've recognized who the human person is? At what institutional level is policy best implemented? Should we be thinking at the federal level, the state level, the local level? Are local communities the best place to address our pressing concerns? So we want to help students to grow in the virtue and the wisdom to navigate and be true leaders in the public policy space. And so we are excited to launch this new program, and I would invite anyone interested in it to talk to me afterwards or to check out our website. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
And thank you all for joining us either in person or online. If you have friends that you think might be interested in this, within a few hours, the program will be archived on our website and online. And for those of you that are here in person, please join us outside for some Chick-fil-A. Thank you so much.